In the spring of 1942, Peter Scott walked into an Army recruiting office in Brooklyn. He had just turned 20 years old. He was determined to fight, but his thick glasses stopped him cold. The recruiter took one look at his records and said, "Sorry, son, your eyes are not up to par." Scott walked out onto the sidewalk and felt the sting of rejection. He did not accept it. He could not accept it. There was a war on and he wanted to be in it. 2 months later, he noticed a newspaper article. The Army had lowered its vision standards. Scott was back at the recruiting office the next morning. This time, his eyes passed barely. He told the sergeant he wanted the Armored Corps, maybe drive a motorcycle. The sergeant said no problem and handed him a form to sign. What Scott did not know was that the Army had its own plans for him. They sent him to Mississippi for mechanic school, where he breezed through the courses. Then they shipped him to Clovis, New Mexico, a patch of desert he came to hate with a passion. The sand got into everything: his eyes, his food, the airplane engines he worked on. He was a sergeant in charge of a company of mechanics, most of them screw-ups with more time in the service than he had. It was a dead-end job 1,000 miles from the war. He walked into his commanding officer's hut one hot morning and demanded reassignment. The CO needed 14 men for gunnery school. Scott pointed at himself. The officer hesitated. Scott wore glasses. Scott put them in his pocket and said, "They do not know that at gunnery school." The CO wrote his name at the top of the list. By September of 1943, Scott had finished his training and was assigned as left-waist gunner on a brand-new B-17 crew at Grafton Underwood Airfield in England. His pilot was First Lieutenant Giles Kaufman, a quiet man from Lewistown, Pennsylvania, who had studied chemical engineering at Penn State before the war. Kaufman was no nonsense in the air but easygoing on the ground. The rest of the crew took shape around them. The right waist gunner was Paul Spodar, a baby-faced kid from Cleveland whose father, like Scott's, had emigrated from the Ukraine. Scott and Spodar stood back to back in combat, two men who shared more than they knew. On their first mission, Scott watched a German fighter rip through the American formation before he could even raise his gun. He got his chance soon enough. Over Munster and Me-109 stayed too close for too long. Scott tracked it with his .50 caliber, watched his rounds tear into the fuselage, and saw black smoke billow before the enemy plane rolled over and spiraled down. It was his first confirmed kill. He was learning fast. On October 4th, 1943, Kaufman's crew drew a B-17 with the tail number 4230043. The men called her Ruthless. The target that day was Frankfurt, Germany. Before takeoff, Kaufman got into a heated argument with a staff officer over fuel. The pilot insisted the rationing was too tight. He said they would not have enough to make it home. The officer refused to budge. Kaufman had no choice but to take what they gave him. The mission went well enough. The gunners fought off enemy fighters. Kaufman dodged the flak over Frankfurt and dropped his bombs on target, but on the return leg, with the English coast still far ahead, the fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Kaufman knew they would not make it. His voice came over the interphone. "Boys, we are going to have to lighten the aircraft." Scott and Spodar began throwing everything loose out the side windows. The pilot told them to dump the guns. Scott did not hesitate. He unbolted his .50 caliber and shoved it out into the slipstream. Spodar did the same. Then went the ammunition. Ruthless was now flying over Belgium without an escort and without most of her defenses. Kaufman dropped the bomber down to treetop level, hugging the earth to avoid detection. Pastures and forests gave way to marshland, then rocky coves, then white-capped waves. The North Sea opened beneath them. 2 RAF Spitfires appeared off the wings. Their pilots waving, Kaufman gave the order, "Prepare to ditch." Every man went to his assigned station. Scott and Spodar helped the ball turret gunner out of his cramped position. The tail gunner joined them. All 10 men crowded into the radio room as Kaufman put Ruthless down on the water. The tail hit first. Seawater poured through the cracked fuselage before the plane even stopped moving. The cold hit Scott like a fist. Someone pulled the lever to release the life rafts. Men climbed through the overhead hatch in heavy flight gear, moving in what felt like slow motion. The water was already up to their chins. Scott was the last man in the radio room. He pulled himself up through the hatch with someone's hand grabbing his arm, and he climbed onto the sinking bomber's tail section. He went into the water feet first and swam toward the rafts. One by one, 9 men climbed aboard. The radioman was still standing on the stabilizer, his life vest only half inflated. He could not swim. Someone yelled for him to dive in. He did. They pulled him aboard. Kaufman took a head count. All 10 men were alive. A Spitfire dove low and dropped signal flares into the water. The British patrol boat, Lord Keith, reached them 2 hours later. The crew was back at Grafton Underwood within days. Ruthless was gone, but the men who flew her were not. On October 14, 1943, the American 8th Air Force launched 291 B-17s against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. Sitting at his left waist gun, Peter Scott knew the history. 2 months earlier, the same target had cost 60 bombers and 600 men. The Luftwaffe met the formation with more than 400 fighters. They came in waves, firing rockets from twin-engine planes and tearing through the bomber box with cannons blazing. Scott fired his .50 caliber until the barrel burned. Then flak bursts shredded the engines. Black smoke poured from the cowlings of number 1 and number 2. The B-17 shuddered, fell behind the formation, and began losing altitude fast. Kaufman ordered the crew to bail out. In the radio room, the men scrambled for the escape door. Scott pulled off his headset, grabbed a walk-around oxygen bottle, and carried a fresh ammo box to the tail gunner. By the time he returned, the bomber was falling through 26,000 feet. He hooked up the emergency oxygen and followed the others toward the door, but the bottle ran dry without him noticing. The last thing Scott remembered was reaching for the door. Then everything went black. He woke up in freefall, tumbling end over end in the bitter German air. He had no idea which way was up. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute cracked open and jerked him to a stop. The breath knocked out of his lungs, looking up. He saw 3 small parachutes far above him. He looked down at the German fields rushing toward him. He hit the ground hard in a freshly plowed field, alone, somewhere deep inside Germany. All 9 of his crewmates had already been captured. Scott gathered his parachute and scanned the horizon. A farmer with a shotgun was walking toward him. He reached for his .45 pistol. It was not there. He had left it on his bunk that morning. 4 German soldiers emerged from the woods 100 yards away. Scott slid into a shallow gully and shoved his parachute under the water, weighing it down with rocks. The farmer and the soldiers talked, gestured, and searched the stream bed, but they never crossed the water. When dusk fell, they finally left. Scott crawled behind a lone tree on the far bank. He was still free that night. He opened his escape kit. Inside was a silk map, a chocolate bar, 5 French 100-franc notes, and a small compass. 3 green dots glowed on the dial. He tucked the compass into his pants pocket. It was his most valuable possession. He walked west all night, skirting villages and hiding in ditches when vehicles passed. On the 6th day, sleeping in a haystack, he pulled out his compass to plan the night's route. The compass slipped from his fingers and disappeared into the straw. Before dawn, a random ray of moonlight caught the green glow of the compass dial buried in the straw. Scott dug it out and tucked it safely into his pocket. Later that same night, a Polish forced laborer named Walter found him in a barn. He fed Scott apples and later guided him past a German patrol, pointing him toward the road that led to France. Scott crossed into France on the 7th night. He knew because the road signs changed color and shape. A French farmer found him hiding in a haystack the next morning. The man grabbed Scott by the shoulders, said "Oui, oui," and then dragged him through the village shouting, "American!" Scott clamped a hand over the man's mouth. The farmer gave him food, then an old black suit with pants too short, and a beret. Scott ripped the lining from the jacket to make a scarf, pulled the beret low, and looked like a poor French civilian. He caught a ride to Nancy. In Nancy, Scott dodged 2 plainclothes policemen by joining a group of Frenchmen singing loudly at a cafe. A waiter fed him soup, gave him a bed for the night, and pointed him toward the train station the next morning. Scott bought a ticket to Marseille. His French was almost non-existent, so he rode down Perpignan and passed it through the ticket window. He fell asleep on the train and woke up heading north. A conductor redirected him at Avignon. He finally reached Perpignan late in the evening, slipped under the station platform, and slept until dawn. The next morning, Scott began the hike to the Spanish border. The distance was only 30 miles, but every step was uphill. When he crested the first ridge, he saw the Pyrenees for the first time. Jagged, snow-capped peaks stretched to the horizon, some rising above 10,000 feet. "I'll never make it," he said aloud, and sat down in the middle of the road. His feet were so swollen he had to cut his shoes off with his hunting knife. He sat there for a long time, alone, exhausted and starving. Then he got up. He could not go back. There was nothing left but to go forward. A French cyclist lent him a bicycle for a few miles, then took it back in fright when Scott admitted he was American. Scott kept walking. He slept in woods, begged for food at a farmhouse, and was chased away by a man with a club. An elderly waitress at a Mountain Crossroads restaurant gave him a plate of kidney stew and fresh bread. She pointed toward a small road leading deeper into the mountains and made the sign of the cross. Scott walked through the night, following the path up into the peaks. The next morning he woke on a crest at sunrise. He looked down one side and saw the village where the old woman had fed him. He looked the other way and saw Spain. Scott knelt on the mountaintop and thanked God. He pulled out his prayer book and marked the 14th page, 14 days since he had bailed out over Germany. Then he walked down into Spain. Outside the town of Girona, a Spanish soldier leveled a rifle at him and marched him to the local prison. He was locked in an 8-by-8-foot cell with a dirt floor. A German in civilian clothes interrogated him. Scott gave only his name, rank, and serial number. His hair was cut off. His food was thin soup. After a week, a British wing commander named Griffin was thrown into his cell. Scott told him everything. "My guess is the Americans don't know you're alive," Griffin said. 2 days later, Griffin was released. 3 days after that, a Spanish officer arrived to escort Scott out of prison. Scott was flown to Gibraltar, then to London. An ambulance took him to a military hospital. He was thin, weak, and very sick, but he was alive. The 8th Air Force did not quite believe his story. A man who evaded 600 miles through Germany and France without any help from the resistance was unheard of. They kept a military policeman outside his hospital room until a staff officer from the 384th Bomb Group confirmed his identity. General Ira Eaker himself awarded Scott the Silver Star. The citation read, "His gallantry, skill, and fighting spirit serve as an inspiration to his fellow flyers." Scott was the first American airman to escape from Germany entirely on his own. He had made it home. The winter cold of December 1944 bit through Anthony Tetta's leather jacket as the Army truck dropped him at Chelveston Air Base. At 19 years old, he was a second lieutenant and navigator for the 305th Bomb Group, his silver wings still new enough to feel unfamiliar against his chest. The navigator's barracks held 11 empty bunks, and the veteran warming himself by the stove pointed to one without emotion. "None of those guys are coming back," he said. Tetta stored his gear in silence, understanding for the first time what it meant to be a replacement in a combat squadron. Christmas Eve morning came at 2:30 a.m. with a sergeant shaking Tetta awake. The general briefing revealed the target, Gießen, Germany, and the Nidda airfield beyond it. Tetta's bomber lifted off last in the formation, a position the men called Tail End Charlie, the most exposed spot in the group. Fog swallowed the runway seconds after takeoff. The B-17 bucked through the prop wash of the planes ahead, flying blind until it broke into clear blue sky 20 minutes later. The flak over Gießen was moderate, but close enough to rattle the cockpit, and when Teta returned to Chelveston that afternoon, he found his aircraft had taken minor damage. The interrogation officer handed him a double shot of scotch. Teta drank it in one swallow, grinned, and said the flak was too close. On January 5, 1945, Teta's pilot Jerry Chart drew a different aircraft for the day's mission. The bomber was B-17 number 501, and her name was Old Miss Destry. She had flown 107 successful missions over Germany, 9 of them to Berlin, and every crew in the 366th Squadron knew her reputation. Some airmen whispered that a bomber with that many trips was overdue for bad luck, but Teta pushed the thought aside and climbed into the nose compartment with his charts. Old Miss Destry delivered her bomb load without incident and carried the crew home through clear skies without a single flak hole to mark her skin. She would finish the war with 138 combat missions to her name, but on this day she simply did what she had always done. She brought the men back. The next morning, January 6th, the briefing officer pulled the cloth from the map and the room groaned. Cologne. The city on the Rhine was a fortress of anti-aircraft batteries, and every man in the room knew what that name meant. Chart's crew drew a B-17 called Fancy Pants, and Tedda studied the artwork on her nose as the truck carried them to the hardstand. The takeoff was smooth, the climb to altitude steady, and for a while the mission looked routine. Then the 366th Squadron reached the initial point, and the sky turned black with flak bursts. The lead bomber overshot the target. The entire formation made the decision to circle 360 degrees and come back for a second bomb run. Tedda watched the flak multiply as the bombers turned, calculating the odds in his head and not liking the numbers. He had already developed a survival routine for the bomb run. 2 flak jackets, one on his body and one pressed beneath his navigator's desk. There he wedged his 5'2" frame as tightly as he could. The toggler watched him from the bomb site and wished he had a desk too. The flak on the second pass was just as intense as the first, but Jerry Chart held the formation and Fancy Pants took no direct hits. The bombs fell away and the bomber lifted as the weight released. But the bomb bay doors would not close. Sergeant Carl Robinson, the flight engineer, crawled back to check the mechanism and reported that the doors were jammed open with the wind drag from the open bay. The bomber could not keep formation speed. Chart ordered Robinson to try the manual crank, and the engineer worked the emergency system as the rest of the crew watched the squadron pull ahead. Slowly, with a cold wind tearing through the fuselage, Robinson cranked the doors shut. Chart turned for home and landed Fancy Pants safely on the Chelveston runway. The crew had completed their 5th combat mission. A few hours later, each of them pinned on the silver wings of an air medal. Tedda allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through the 30 still ahead. The briefing on the morning of February 3, 1945, was like nothing the 305th Bomb Group had ever seen. Over 1,000 fortresses would strike Berlin, escorted by more than 900 P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. The target was the center of the Nazi government, Gestapo headquarters, the Reich Chancellery, the German Air Ministry. Anthony Tedda sat with his crew and listened as the briefing officer warned of heavy flak and a Luftwaffe that would defend the capital in force. The young navigator checked the cross around his neck and tried to keep his breathing steady. Over the English Channel, Tedda gazed out through the plexiglass nose of B-17 number 015 and saw an impossible sight. Bombers stretched from horizon to horizon, gleaming in the clear winter sky, a river of olive drab stretching more than 300 miles from lead aircraft to tail. When the first fortress dropped its bombs on Berlin at 10:30 that morning, the last American bomber was just passing over Holland. Then the flak started. Berlin's gunners were the most experienced in Germany, and they poured everything into the sky. Black bursts pocked the air around the formation, shaking B-17 number 015 like a toy. A heavy impact shoved the bomber to the left. Tedda crawled out from under his navigator's desk to check the damage. Number 3 engine was trailing smoke, its propeller slowing, then stopping as Jerry Chart feathered the blades. The interphone was dead. A flak burst had ripped a hole in the roof next to the top turret, and blue smoke curled through the cockpit. Tedda climbed up to find Chart and asked for instructions. The pilot's voice was calm but direct. Plot a course for Sweden just in case. Then word came from the bomb bay. 5 bombs were stuck, jammed in their racks. A second pass at releasing them manually failed. The 366th Squadron pulled ahead and B-17 number 015 began to lose altitude, alone in a vast German sky. Tedda worked his charts, recalculating headings for the reduced airspeed. Chart faced a decision: nurse the wounded bomber back to England on 3 engines, or divert to neutral Sweden and sit out the war. Then Carl Robinson spotted 2 specks approaching from above, every gunner tensed. But the fighters pulled alongside, waggled their wings, and revealed the familiar silhouette of P-51 Mustangs. Chart made his choice. They would go home. The 2 Mustangs stayed close, one off each wingtip, as the B-17 labored west. Hours passed, fuel ran low, but the coastline of England finally appeared, and Tata's navigation proved true. There was Chelveston, its 3 intersecting runways spread below. Chart eased the bomber into its approach. But at 1,000 feet, the landing gear would not deploy. The flaps would not engage. The flak that had torn through the fuselage had also burned out the fuses in the electrical box. Chart did not hesitate. He sent Robinson to the fuse box with an order: find an empty .50 caliber shell casing from the waist gunner's floor. The flight engineer grabbed a casing, jammed it across the 2 burned posts, and felt the current pulse through his heavy gloves. Co-pilot George Wisniewski hit the landing gear switch. The wheels lowered and locked. Robinson pulled the casing free and repositioned it over the flap controls. The flaps caught the wind. Chart set B-17 number 015 down on the runway as smoothly as if she had all 4 engines running. After the engines died, the crew climbed out and walked around their bomber in silence. They counted 168 holes in the fuselage, wings, and turret. In the bomb bay, 5 live bombs still sat in their racks waiting to be disarmed. That evening, tail gunner John Cuffman wrote in his diary, "Couldn't drop right side of bombs because we were all shot up. Saw 5 B-17s blow up and go down. God, I'm glad it is over." In March, the 305th was tasked with a new kind of mission. The British had developed experimental 9,000-pound bombs designed to crack the thick concrete submarine pens at Hamburg. They called them Disney bombs, and they were so massive that they would not fit inside the bomb bay. They had to be strapped beneath the wings. Colonel Henry MacDonald test flew the configuration, using the entire runway and scraping the tail fins on the tarmac. His verdict: we can do it. Every crew in the 366th Squadron would have to do it too. On the Hamburg run, Teta saw the future of aerial combat. The squadron had been warned about German jet fighters, but none of the crews had ever seen one in action. Then they came through the formation, fast, silent, impossible to track. John Cuffman fired 150 rounds at 2 streaking jets, hitting nothing. The new technology of the Luftwaffe was impressive, but it was too late. The Mustangs drove the jets away, and the Disney bombs struck the submarine pens. Germany was running out of pilots faster than she could build airplanes. For Jerry Chart's crew, the Berlin raid had proven they could survive the worst the enemy could throw at them. They had 34 combat missions behind them now, and they were determined to finish the job. In the years after the war, the Silver Star medal that hung in Peter Scott's home was never displayed. It stayed in a drawer, a private reminder of something he rarely spoke about. But the courage that earned it did not fade when he took off his uniform. In 1977 at Kennedy Airport, a bomb threat was called in against an American Airlines DC-10. Scott, then a shift supervisor, walked onto the darkened aircraft alone to turn on the auxiliary lights so police could search it safely. No bomb was found, but those who saw him that day knew the same coolness under pressure that had carried him 600 miles through Germany and France had not left him. Flight engineer Carl Robinson made it home to Texas. The rest of Chart's original crew, Hall, Stiles, Getz, Christensen, and Wisniewski, each built their own quiet post-war lives. They carried the same private memories as their pilot and navigator. Decades later, the old crewmates began to find each other again. Tita and Chart talked on the phone now and then, knowing the miles between Connecticut and Montana made a visit unlikely. Scott saw his right waist gunner, Paul Spodar, for the first time in 59 years when they met in person after a long-distance reunion. In Wisconsin, 4 members of Chart's original crew gathered at the home of George Wisniewski. They ate together, drank together, and remembered the antics of boys who had faced flak over Berlin and somehow come home. It would be the last time some of them saw each other. What these men did in the skies over Germany was not something they called heroic. They said they were just doing a job. But the job required them to climb into a damaged bomber day after day, knowing the odds, and fly straight into the guns. They trusted their pilot, they trusted their crew, and they trusted a thin layer of aluminum and plexiglass to bring them back. That trust is what held the formation together. That is what the Lucky Bastards Club really meant. Not luck, but the quiet resolve to keep going when every instinct said stop. The last of them are gone now. But the image of a young navigator touching the cross around his neck as the wheels touch down at Chelveston remains. So does the memory of a waist gunner kneeling on a mountaintop in the Pyrenees to thank God for one more sunrise. That is the truest monument they ever had. If you have your own family stories from this generation or memories of a father or grandfather who served with the 8th Air Force, we would like to hear them. Please share them in the comments below. And if you would like to help us keep telling these stories, consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.